Thank you, everybody. So, our panel is going to get to talk about some of the fun stuff, the economic, political, and other social implications of some of the trends that Ted Fishman discussed in his opening presentation, and that the panel of scientists signaled with their description of the research may be coming at us in the years ahead. I should mention there was some allusion to the dinner that we had last night. Many of the panelists were there, and everybody came in. They were asked to put on their name badge a guess for how many years they thought a child born today would live to. And there was a wide range from the 80s to the 110s or above. And but the real wager came when the food was ordered. There was an eggplant, fish, or steak option. And I'll confess, I went for steak. So, I mean, the real question with longevity research, as you know, is not whether you're going to put your money where your mouth is, but whether you're going to put your mouth where your money is. And I guess I was betting against it. But I wanted to mention, to frame our discussion, a couple of the tables that are in your handout and that ran in Slate the last couple of days. These are just some numbers to give some background to the trends that we're talking about and their implications. There's I think it's in the back of the handout. There's 5 charts labeled A through E. Now, Ted talked about a couple of these in his presentation. I wanted to just mention a couple others. There's one that says Chart B, and it shows I'll describe it for those of you who don't have the handout. It shows the increases in life expectancy, not at birth, but at specific ages, remaining life expectancy, from going from 1930 to the present. And what's striking about the chart to me is if you look at life expectancy at age 40 in 1930, okay, that was just under 29.7 years remaining. You're 40 years old, you have slightly less than 30 years remaining to you. By the year 2000, you have 29.9 more years remaining to you than that 40-year-old person in 1930. You have more years remaining at the age of 50 than that person did at age 40 in 1930. If you look at age 50 a 50-year-old person in 1930, they had 22.1 years remaining life expectancy. By 2006, you have 22.4 years remaining, more years remaining at age 60 than that 50-year-old person had. So by that, all of which is to say that by the measure of remaining life expectancy, 50 is the new 40 and 60 is the new 50. Okay. A second chart that I wanted to mention, it's labeled Chart D, and it shows the projected increase from the present, from about 2005 to 2050 around the world of the population of people over age 60 as a percentage of their country, And basically, among the 8 countries, several of these are developing world. In Brazil, in China, in Indonesia, in Mexico, and South Korea, all of those countries, and they're representative of many others, as of 2005, people over 60 were 8 to 14% of the populations of those countries. 8 to 14%. In every one of those countries, the projection is by 2050, people over 60 are 25 to 41% of the population. Okay, that's a tripling in those countries, in some cases a quadrupling. That is the magnitude of the effect on societies that we're talking about around the world, according to the projections. And the last chart I wanted to mention is labeled Chart E, and it shows the age of disease onset. And this goes to what was discussed by Aubrey de Grey and several other people in the first panel. There is extending life, and there is extending healthy life. And this is a chart that was done 7 years ago, and it shows the change from 2 cohorts of men, almost a century apart, in terms of the age at which they developed certain diseases. Okay, so for the men born in 1830 to 1845, cohort in the 1800s, and then men born 1918 to 1927, who of course are reaching late age at the end of the 20th century. The difference in the onset of heart disease was 9.5 years between them. So the second cohort in the late 20th century is getting heart disease 9.5 years later. They're getting arthritis 11 years later. They're getting respiratory illness, chronic respiratory illness 11.2 years later. So again, not here by the standard of life expectancy, but by the standard of health expectancy, healthy life. Those men of the later cohort are arguably, in a sense, a decade younger than people of equivalent age a century earlier. So those are some of the backgrounds for our conversation. And now I wanted to get to our panelists. We have a star-studded lineup here, and I'll introduce them each in turn. And we'll give them each about 10 minutes, and then if you guys run out of time in the 10 minutes, don't worry about it. Just raise your finger, and we'll come back to you and pick up where you left off in the Q&A. The first one is Ted Fishman, and he gave the introductory talk, so some of you heard the introduction. He's the author of Shock of Gray, The Aging of the World's Population. He ran his own trading firm. He's written for everybody, the New York Times Magazine, Harper's Esquire, and several others.
And I will write for everybody.
Right. And the other thing we learned about Ted, I believe at dinner his phone rang, and if I'm not mistaken, his ringtone is opera. So without further ado, Ted Fishman.
Thanks, Will. Will and I had a good time putting together some of the materials for the conference, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much. A couple bookkeeping things first. Some things I'm indebted to. J. Olshansky's wonderful book, The Quest for Immortality. I highly recommend it. Aubrey's book, Ending Aging. Yeah, also wonderful, and I recommend it, and I'm hoping you'll sign it. One other thing, I was upbraided during a bathroom break during the last panel when one of the Japanese guests today came up to me and asked me where did I get those outlandish numbers on the centenarians. And I'm hoping they're not outlandish, but it's possible that they're outlandish. I was asked to list my sources. Here's just a few: BBC, Washington Post, Independent of London, CBS News, Asahi Shimbun. Let's look over these at lunch. Maybe they got it wrong. And I'm also proposing that we put the sources on the New America Foundation website for this, and then we can have a debate on that. I'm not wedded to those numbers, but I think we should have the right numbers. Fascinating panel the last session. I really liked it. I'm going to, like all big issues, there's lots of potential for contradiction, and I'm going to jump for that potential and contradict myself in several ways during my brief remarks here. Everybody who spoke, and I think everybody in the room, wants an optimal result from life extension research. We want long life. We want good health during that life. But it's not necessarily the only result everybody wants. Some people will take the bargain for a less optimal life, even if it is longer. Think of your ill relatives. They hold on to life. And it's a choice that they make, and they may make it for many reasons. They may make it because there's oblivion on the other side. They may make it because they have a metaphysical view of their responsibility to stay alive. They may make it because they have an irrational fear of death. They may make that choice because, or a rational fear of death. Right? That's the oblivion on the other side. Or they may make it because they hope for a cure for what ails them. I think of my own father in this situation. He was quite ill for 16 years, and you would think he was completely checked out, but at a Thanksgiving dinner or a latke party, if you made the right kind of bawdy joke, he would lift his head and laugh. And he was there for the few remaining kinds of joys that he looked forward to. And if science does deliver a less than optimal future, people may very well take it, and that may be our future. So that I do think that's something to consider, even if it's not our highest hope. It's not a bad hope. I also wanted to talk about the difference between aging for an individual and aging for a place. These are very different phenomena, although they are related. When you get the kinds of longer lives that Will had referred to in the charts that you all have, you can see the impact of longer life. But this is not the primary reason why places around the world are aging. The reason why places are aging, like Japan, which ages about 0.6 years, their population, the median grows about 0.6 years for every calendar year, is mostly because of low birth rates. and a smaller pipeline of young people coming into the population. And this can make a place feel quite old. So when we're thinking about what society would be like with lots of more older age and an aged environment, it can happen even without people living longer. It can happen when there are fewer young people around. And many of the debates that are here in Washington now are around population aging, not necessarily wholly about human aging. And it's a really important distinction. I'm going to talk about that in terms of some of the moral choices we make. Also, I was moved by the passion on the last panel. Maybe all of you were. I mean, here you see very impassioned advocates for their point of view. They argue about their metaphors. They are willing for the occasional ad hominem attack. And this is just fighting over an idea. It's not fighting over the great treasure that is longer life. Imagine if there were resource allocation issues around longer life, and there certainly will be, how vehement the attacks will be. I mentioned in my opening remarks that it's interesting to me that the Department of Defense is on the vanguard of this. You know, if we face a constant war in the world because people are fighting over the life they have, think about the intensity of a conflict that might come to blows because of a much longer life people want. A whole continent was conquered in search of the fountain of youth. In my book, Shock of Grey, I go through many examples where people were enslaved, butchered, and other things rather gruesome when people in a more powerful position than they were thought that the weaker souls were instrumental to their longer life. It can happen. So I think we ought to consider, for a moment here, that there are quite a few multiple scenarios for extreme longevity. Not all of them have us at the peak of our health for our lifetimes, and not all of them have all of us having access to longer life. There might be some competition around that, and that's something to consider. And I'm going to talk about a little bit of the competition I see when I go around the world, just examining population aging alone, not even human longevity. In the past, for most of human history, the young were commonly in the position of being the instruments of the old, right? So when wars were held, the second, third, and fourth sons were marched into war because those were the jobs available to them if they didn't inherit the land. Immigrants went abroad to stake new places because they didn't get a stakehold at home. Children were valuable on the farm as labor. When they were no longer as valuable for the farm, birth rates went down. Young people were valuable as slaves, not only real slaves, but as wage slaves. And they were imported and delivered at the point of a gun all over the world for this purpose for most of human history. In recent history, in the 20th century, Mao Zedong had the idea of the hero mother, the mother who should have 10 children. And those children would be taken away from her and communized. And then the state made a radical turnaround and said a mother should only have one child. So human engineering with human beings as the engineered parts, social engineered parts, is a reality we live with, and human beings haven't gotten past that. So I think these ought to inform your vision of the future and something we all want to fight. And if the passion of the previous panel is any indication, on the positive side, their better angels are strong indeed, and that's a song we ought to march to. So I thought I would talk a little bit about what I saw in researching Shock of Grey. And one of these stories that resonates with me very strongly and actually started me on the track of aging grew out of my last book, China Inc. in which I found myself very often in these young, fabulous Chinese cities that were neon wonderlands, energetic places filled with young people. 150 million to 200 million people would come off the farm, most of them below the age of 25, into the cities. And I started thinking, why were the cities so young? And when you left the cities, the countryside was so old. Outside of urban China, it's like a vast ghetto of 800 million older people. I recently called this the Dorian Gray economy, which is the surface for the economy in China is all youth, and when you go beyond the city, it's all the things China pushes aside and holds behind the curtain. And it occurred to me, because I'm from Chicago and I see discrimination where I live, that there were reasons for this separation of young and old, this ruthless separation of young and old. The rest of the world was shopping for youth in China, and not interested in the older population or the baggage it had in terms of its health care and benefits and all the other things that older workforces around the rest of the world are perceived to carry with them. There's some misperception, but a very willing and widespread misperception on that. And China was willing to answer this call. It was willing to send its young people into the cities, hundreds of millions of them, and make them employable, and make its older people unemployable, except in one instance, as the caregivers for the children of the young workers. So China has made instrumental to its economic designs and its dreams for its future a vast population of older people who work for free. So when you hire a young factory worker in China, you're getting an older worker in for free. And this has tilted the social relationship between young and old around the world, because the rest of the world comes to hire young people, and it comes to draft older workers for free to provide all the social services in China that the rest of the world doesn't want to pay for. And when you have an older tilting of the world population, it gets older and older. You might see alignments of this kind, where one generation is pitted against another, and that all depends on how capable people are and how we adjust. In Shock of Gray, I have strategies that I talk about that avoid that scenario, but as the world exists now, it's a real scenario. But there's a positive thing that happens when people grow older. And in a world of extreme long age, they might grow even more positive. People get more committed to their sense of place because it's a place where they live, and they see themselves being for a long time. So in a way, and I walk through these in the book, age can rejuvenate a place. One place I talk about is Sarasota, Florida, and I compare it to a beat-up Midwestern industrial city. In the industrial city, everything in the city makes you feel old at 50 psychologically, but in Sarasota, people go there when they're 65 and they're kids, because the city has willed itself into a place where retirement begins at a time of rejuvenation and exploration, and it becomes a life stage. And as you think about extreme longevity, we will have one long series of life stage after life stage, and it can be very positive as people reassert their place in the world.
Ted, why don't we move on, and we'll come back to the remaining points. Okay.
If I could just say one last thing, and that is about resource allocation and the pharmaceutical industry, which is, I think, one thing I'd like the panel to address is, will this be a patentable process, or will this be something that's open to the rest of the world? Because if you deny it to people, if you deny long life to people, you're de facto causing a holocaust. And is that something that we want to do?
Thank you, Ted. Next up is Jason Furman. Jason, for those of you who don't know him, is one of the smartest economists you'll ever meet. He is. I'll do this in reverse order. He's. Was that a compliment? Oh, what they say about the scientists. He's on leave from the Brookings Institute, where he's a senior fellow in economic studies and director of the Hamilton Project. He's conducted research in a wide range of areas, including fiscal policy, tax policy, health, economic, social security, and monetary policy, all of which we'll be discussing today. And he is now the Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, so we're going to try really, really hard not to get him in trouble today. Jason, we've been talking about trends that obviously are going to have huge economic ramifications, and we hope you'll be able to enlighten us about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. There were two things in that introduction that were inaccurate, but I'll only correct one, which is that I unfortunately left Brookings and am now entirely in the government. wanted to divide my comments into two areas. The first set talking about normal increases in life expectancy, the type that we've experienced over the last century, the type that when we look at projections for the future of Social Security, Medicare, and think about the future that we use. And then after that, we'll have a little bit of fun speculating on things that I have absolutely no scientific knowledge of or economic knowledge of, which would be more extraordinary, discontinuous increases in how long people could live and some of the consequences that would have for economic policy. Within the framework of the normal, I think everything Will said is obviously true. We're seeing profound shifts, and we'll continue to see profound shifts, but a lot of them are profound in the way that watching the paint dry on the side of your house is profound. Any given minute, you're not really noticing a big change, but after a while, a lot changes. People talk about the United States as a whole is going to look, 40 or 50 years from now, more like Florida does today, and that's true. You could also phrase it as the United States 40 or 50 years from now demographically will look more like Germany and France does today. And you go to Germany and France, and they don't look like some strange alien place filled with a completely different population structure. They look sort of normal to us, and we look sort of normal to us. And I suspect in 2050, if we could watch it today, would look reasonably normal, and certainly by 2050 we would have gotten used to it. That said, the changes in life expectancy do have big effects over time. I think Ted brought up one very important point, which is a lot of what's important, especially for a program like Social Security, is actually not necessarily life expectancy, but it's the dependency ratio. How many retirement age people are supported by working age people? And that depends on two things. One, how many children we have, and if everyone has, every couple has 2 children by the time they get into retirement, there'll be 2 of those workers there for them. And so it's determined by fertility, and it's also determined by how long you live. The main changes we've seen in Social Security, and that are the cause of the imbalance we have in Social Security today, as I think Ted alluded to, are primarily a decline in fertility. We had very high fertility rates for a very long time, and then the combination of affluence, birth control, changing culture led to a relatively dramatic decline in fertility rates. And if you could just readjust Social Security to be in balance for the current fertility trends, then you'd pretty much stay almost in balance forever based on the current forecast. You have a slight upward drift in the cost rate of Social Security because the population will continue to age as life expectancies continue. But the main thing you need to do in Social Security is balance the system to reflect the large declines in fertility. And once you've done that, you're 95% of the way there for the foreseeable future within what I was calling the normal scenario of the paint drying. Sometimes people speak about life expectancy, especially in fiscal circles, which I travel in, as bad news. Isn't it terrible? We just discovered that people are going to live even longer than before. And, how are we going to cope with that? Obviously, it's very good news, and it's not just good news because people are going to live longer. It tends to be correlated with a lot of other good things. People tend, when they're living longer, to stay in school longer. They tend to save more. The combination of those, plus the higher population growth and faster labor force growth, raises the growth rate. It might even, in some models, raise the growth rate per capita. You tend to see reduced fertility. So in a lot of circumstances, a lot of good things can go along with increased mortality, with decreased mortality, increased immortality, one might call it. The question then is how you cope with this. A certain amount of the coping is something that individuals will obviously have to do for themselves, whether it is deciding how long they want to stay in the workforce, deciding whether they want to make greater investments at an earlier age to continue working or at a later age to get retrained to continue working, how much they want to save, and even Social Security itself. in a sense, has a voluntary do-it-yourself retirement age. The normal retirement age right now is age 66, but you can collect benefits, start collecting benefits anytime really from age 62 to 70. The trick is if you collect them at 62, you get something lower for your whole life. If you wait till 70, you get something higher your whole life. It's designed so that the total amount you're getting from when you start collecting until you die is about the same in either case. But people can choose to exercise that, and that's something we're actually seeing. There had been a long-term trend towards earlier retirement, more and more people collecting benefits at age 62, and that's now started to reverse itself. It's reversed itself quite dramatically in the Great Recession we've seen over the last few years, as older people who would normally see a bad economy and maybe leave the labor force forever, start collecting Social Security benefits and be done with it, have actually stayed in the labor force. It's probably partly the result of declines in 401ks and their savings resources, partly the result of things like unemployment insurance. You can stay on that for longer, and maybe that'll keep you attached to the labor force, looking for a job, hoping to get back in the job market, rather than going on Social Security, giving up, looking for work, and staying on that forever. There's also been a big increase in people having second careers, people who retire maybe for a year or two and then go back and start working again. A lot of that are the choices that people make and the options they have. There's obviously a lot that the government and public policy can do to help people make those choices and expand the options they have. One of the most important things in preparing for long life is obviously saving. As we've seen a decline in defined benefit pensions and expansion in defined contribution pensions, that has a lot of advantages for people in terms of portability, choice, probably adapts itself to the types of work styles people have where they move more quickly from job to job now. But it also makes it a lot easier for people to make bad choices, to not enroll in those savings plans, to make bad investment choices, to not save the right amount of money, to not annuitize at retirement, or whatever else. So a certain amount of the frontier of public policy in this area is helping people make better choices, maybe by setting the defaults. And one proposal the president has is automatic IRAs. If you don't have a pension plan at your work, your employer would have to set up an IRA for you, and you'd automatically have your pay deducted and put into that IRA unless you chose to opt out of it. Combine that with something like refundable progressive tax credits that would help low-income people more than high-income people, because right now low-income people have fewer tax incentives to save. As people age, education is obviously becomes increasingly important, increasingly valuable, because you would in a sense think about the returns to that education of the number of years that you're going to exercise it and command higher wages as a result of that. With every extra year you're going to be in the workforce, the amount of time you have to earn extra money from your education rises, and the amount of time you in effect have to repay the benefits of that education rise. A last issue is the set of challenges related to older workers, giving them options, should they choose to do so, to stay in the workforce, to continue working, and making sure public policy is, first of all, not disincentivizing that. One of the strongest predictors across countries of how many older people are in the workforce is how much of a disincentive there is. There are European countries where basically for every dollar you earn in the workforce, if you're older, you lose $1 of your pension benefits. The United States and Japan are two of the best countries in that regard in terms of having a relatively small penalty for older workers who continue in the workforce, and you see that in correspondingly large differences in participation rates at older ages. So part of what you're trying to do is facilitate choice. And a big reason you're trying to facilitate that choice is an important trend we've seen over the last few decades, which is a big increase in inequality in longevity. In 1980, at age 65, the top decile could expect to live 0.3 years longer than the bottom decile. barely any difference at all in life expectancy. You might be a lot richer, you might have a bigger house, you might have a bigger TV, but you lived about the same length. By the year 2000, that gap in life expectancies was 1.6 years. So gone from almost nothing to 1.6, and that's a trend, I think, as Ted said, that one could potentially see accelerating and increasing over time, and one that will pose an increasing set of challenges for public policy. It's hard, we sort of accept that some people work harder and are luckier or what have you and end up with more money and less money. There's a little bit less of an acceptance, especially around scarcity and the choices in the medical system that tolerates discrepancies in life expectancy. And as those discrepancies grow, the challenges will grow with it. Wanted to, in the second and shorter part of my remarks, speculate a little bit about some of the extraordinary increases in life expectancy. What would happen if people started to live to 150 years and we saw something discontinuous from the regular paint drying process that we've seen over the last century. And in this context, I can tell you I'm speaking for myself. The administration's entire set of contingency plans around the event that anyone lives to 150 or 250 consist of the random thoughts I've had over the last couple days preparing for this conference, and I haven't had a chance to check with the president as to whether they reflect his views as well. So with that caveat and disclaimer, I think there's a couple areas beyond some of the usual ones that people think about that it would raise an interesting set of challenges and change the way we think about it. The first is government regulation, and one of the things in the area of safety. And one of the things that we do in safety regulation is you often think about the value of life. Sometimes you think about a quality-adjusted life year, and there's a lot of different ways to get to that number. But most of them have in common something like the present discounted value of your future earnings. If you're going to live a lot longer, you're going to probably earn money for a lot longer, and in a sense, the way we think about the value of that life will go up a lot more. Put another way, if we've managed to, whatever it is the scientists say would make everyone live to 150, cured all of that or figured all of that out, you'd really be pretty unfortunate if people died in car accidents or in coal mines or in any of the other ways that they might die. It's obviously unfortunate today. It's that much more unfortunate if the only thing keeping you from living another 120 years was that mine safety was regulated in a relatively lax way. So I think you would have to, the way in which you think about the extent to which the government regulates around safety, the degree to which it's involved, and those balances would change. I think a second is medical care. One of the biggest things we need to do in society is allocate scarce resources, and for the most part we do that through the market and based on what you earn. In the medical system, we do it a little bit differently. Poor people can have Medicaid. Under health reform, people are going to have a responsibility to have health insurance, and will have subsidies to help them have that health insurance. The ratio of the importance of medical care to almost every other good, and right now it's nearly a fifth of the economy, will just be that much higher in the future. So the portion of the economy that one is thinking about and caring about, where you're using maybe a market principle and competition to organize the way in which those services are delivered and paid for, but not at the end of the day having a pure market economy when it comes to how they're ultimately distributed between people, would raise another set of challenges. A third is financial markets. A lot of what financial markets do for individuals is help them spread money over the course of their life and spread risk over the course of their life. So products like annuities are the way people buy insurance against living too long. Life insurance is how people buy insurance against living too short. Reverse mortgages are how you sell your home while you're still living in it, also a form of insurance. A number of these products will become increasingly important if people were living longer and longer lives. At the same time, the process of people living longer lives probably means they would be living more variable lives. So annuities would be extremely important if you weren't sure how much longer you were going to live in retirement. At the same time, it would be hard to organize a market around annuities because you'd be really uncertain if you're the insurance company writing it just how long people are going to live. And even worse, it's not that you're uncertain about how long 10 randomly chosen people are going to live. That uncertainty will be highly correlated. So something extends life expectancy by another decade and your insurance company goes broke. So financial markets will become very important to people at the same time that by themselves they'll have a harder time undertaking that task. And then the last one to mention is one that underlies, I think, some of the challenges we're seeing in a very glacial way today, but in a very large way in the future, is just a tremendous amount of inequality. And that inequality would manifested in how long people live would be glaring and systematic, and I think challenging to society as a whole, but challenging to us economically in terms of finding remedies for it beyond any of the other challenges that we see today and any of the challenges you see in inequality of wealth. You'd see things like schooling would be very important, but there's an awful lot of luck that affects your income. There's an awful lot of that luck that is highly persistent over time, and you spread that over longer times. So you have both people sort of with high and low wealth and high and low longevity, and that would be something that we would need to figure out how to cope with, and whether the implications for our fiscal system, for taxes, for government spending, for how it is we organize ourselves, again, would be quite important, all of which the United States government will figure out if and when it happens.
Thank you, Jason. And by the way, did I forget to introduce myself? I see my name tag over there. I'm Will Salatan, and I write for Slate. And as far as I know, I'm the first person today whose introduction I've gotten accurately. So let me go on to Jay Olshansky. Jay is a professor. Jay, by the way, just put your thumb down anytime you hear something that's not true. He's a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Also a research associate at the Center on Aging at the University of Chicago, and at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he's the first author of The Quest for Immortality, Science at the Frontiers of Aging. And for those of you who haven't already read it, I think in your packet is an article that Jay wrote that's in Slate this week, a terrific article outlining some of his ideas, which he will share with us. Thank you, Jay.
You got it all right. All right, first of all, I'd really like to thank the organizers for having me here today. It's absolutely delightful and just a wonderful group of presentations this morning, and everything I've heard so far just sounds fantastic. I'm going to discuss something that I discussed in the manuscript that was published by Slate, but an article that my colleagues and I published a couple of years ago called The Longevity Dividend. But in order to get into that, let me provide you with a little bit of background to understand why it is that we're making this argument. So I'm going to, I'm a teacher, right? So I'm going to use props to explain the concept I want to get across here. This is one of my favorite props. So this would represent longevity, the water within this bottle. And try and imagine the life expectancy from the bottom to the top representing roughly 85 to 90 years of longevity. So we know that right around the turn of the 20th century, life expectancy was about 50. The vast majority of the deaths that were occurring at that time were due to infectious and parasitic diseases. And in fact, as indicated this morning, the vast majority of all humans ever born actually died before the age of 10 from infectious diseases. So we had very low life expectancy, and within a relatively short time period, public health did an absolutely remarkable job of raising life expectancy rapidly. Remember, if you save a child from dying, you add decades to life. So what happened within a relatively short time period is life expectancy rose up to where we are about today, which is about 80 for women, 75 for men in the United States. It's a little bit different depending on which country you're talking about. But it's important to realize what happened. We traded off, in a way, longer life for worsening health. Now, we got a lot of healthy years along the way, Remember, a lot of these children were dying from infectious diseases, but now we push them into a region of the lifespan where something else has an opportunity to express itself. So they've now made it above this line. But when you make it above this line, you get to see heart disease, cancer, stroke, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, a suite of things that go wrong with us as we grow older. And we had to recognize, even back at the turn of the 20th century, that this trade-off was coming. We knew, because there were people that made it out to older ages, even at the turn of the 20th century, and we knew what was going to go wrong with them. Now, by the way, when you imagine this vial of life expectancy, it should not be viewed as something that rises in a steady way. Try and imagine this in the shape of a vase. Right? So if you're adding equal amounts of water or equal amounts of effort in your effort to go after increasing longevity, you add equal amounts, you actually get smaller incremental increases in life expectancy. In other words, you reach a point of diminishing returns as life expectancy goes higher. Another way to say it is the higher life expectancy gets, the more difficult it becomes to raise it further. We published on this a couple of decades ago. There were a lot of people who didn't like what we said, that once life expectancy gets up to about 80 to 85, it's really not going to change very much more, and we were right. It really has not changed very much since then, quite frankly. Now, here's where we are today, but the question is, where are we headed in the future? Now, what my colleagues and I have suggested, and let me just point out, by the way, that the manuscript that my colleagues and I published, the first one appeared in The Scientist in 2006. One of the co-authors is in the room, Dan Perry, from the Alliance for Aging Research. One of the other co-authors is Rich Miller from the University of Michigan. And the fourth co-author unfortunately passed away about 18 weeks ago, Dr. Bob Butler from the International Longevity Center. So where we are now facing a very unusual scenario. So we had some idea that there was going to be a trade-off here. The question is, what is the trade-off that we're going to face as we add life in this phase of the lifespan? Now, what we are suggesting, and what we have suggested in that article in The Scientist, and we actually published a follow-up piece in the British Medical Journal 2 years ago, is that as we go after the diseases that are now in our face, very much like we went after the diseases that were in our face at the turn of the 20th century, we're now going after the ones that are appearing in this region of the lifespan. So heart disease, cancer, and stroke are the three top killer diseases today. And it came up last night when I asked one of the speakers, what do you think would happen if we succeeded in going after these major fatal diseases? It was a rhetorical question because I knew the answer to that question. If we find a cure for cancer, we would only gain about 3 to 3.5 years in life expectancy for the population. If we find a cure for heart disease, we would only gain about 4 years. If you cure heart disease and cancer together, you would actually get something less than 7 years. So the gains in life expectancy that we can achieve by going after the major fatal diseases today are really not going to be very dramatic. And in fact, I would echo something that Aubrey said earlier. Life extension in and of itself is not the goal. Health extension is the goal. And I think that, and in fact the whole concept, the whole basic premise of this meeting, which was radical life extension, I would actually prefer it was radical health extension, incidentally. So what we have suggested with the longevity dividend is that if we continue to make progress against the major fatal diseases today, the heart disease, the cancer, the stroke, we are going to push human survival into this region of the lifespan out here, where we believe we are going to see diseases of frailty and disability that are far worse than what we see today. In other words, we may see a much more negative trade-off than the one that we saw going from here to here. We may actually experience a level of failure associated with our success in extending life. And by the way, let me symbolically remove this cap, because it's been implied for a long time by many that there's some sort of cap or biological limit to life. There is no biological limit or cap that evolved under the direct force of evolution. So what we're suggesting is that if we continue along these lines, we may very well end up prolonging the period of old age. We may not like what we see. We may see a dramatic increase. We're already going to see a dramatic increase in Alzheimer's disease. It may actually be far worse if we succeed in going after the major fatal diseases today. So what we have suggested with the longevity dividend is really very much in line with what you heard this morning from the scientists who are suggesting that we should be going after the basic biological process of aging itself. Don't just go after the major diseases that are there, but attack the foundation of almost everything that goes wrong with us as we grow older. And if we succeed even by just a little bit, a 3-year delay in aging would achieve the equivalent of a cure for cancer in terms of mortality risk and life expectancy gain. Now, we've actually suggested that what we believe is achievable is a 7-year delay in the biological rate of aging. And why did we choose 7 years? There are a number of reasons, the most important of which is that if you look at the things that go wrong with us as we grow older, including the risk of death itself, the risk doubles about every 7 years. If you can slow aging by 7 years, you effectively reduce the risk of everything that goes wrong with us by half. You eliminate one doubling at every age. The economic benefits, the health benefits we suggest would be huge for the individuals themselves, for the countries in which this occurs, and for all future generations. Now, I'm not suggesting we take money away from efforts to go after heart disease, cancer, and stroke. What I'm suggesting is that we begin paying much more close attention to the underlying risk factor for everything that goes wrong with us as we grow older. Now, the speakers this morning were very calm, they were very sedate, but I think what you don't realize is that the work that they are doing and the work of a number of other laboratories around the world that's focused on this area to try to influence biological aging, in my view, is going to be some of the most profound work to come out of the field of medicine in quite some time. And if you succeed, I think it is a fast track to a Nobel Prize without a doubt. Absolutely. I think I will end there, and I hope at some later time we get a chance to discuss some of the things that happened last night during dinner. So,
okay. Thanks, Jay.
Yeah.
So now we have the problem that elementary school teachers all over the country have, which is 2 Jasons on a panel.
And
so
a
we're going to and a Jay. Our final speaker is Jason Robert. He is, and again, give me the thumbs up, thumbs down, a distinguished professor of biology and Lincoln Professor of Ethics in Biotechnology and Medicine at Arizona State University, the director of the Bioethics Policy and Law Program in the Center for Biology and Society at ASU, and he's published extensively on ethical, conceptual, and methodological issues in developmental biology and evolution. Welcome, Jason.
2 thumbs up as well. So thanks very much. It's a treat to be here, and I like batting cleanup for all sorts of good reasons, including the fact that it gives me an opportunity to give credit where credit is due to the folks who've already spoken. So I'm going to try to do that in order to keep my remarks as brief as possible. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is that we've got at least 2 cohorts of unhappy passengers in our world right now. There are those who are forced to age or die against their will, and these are some of the folks we've been talking about today. They might be aging poorly, suffering greatly. We haven't done a good enough job in terms of expanding their health span, and we haven't done much to expand their lifespan beyond the sort of normal changes that we've seen over the course of the last century. And so that's one group of folks to be worried about. There's another group of folks to be worried about, and these are the folks who are forced to live against their will. And so one of the really interesting features here is that these folks are also aging poorly, suffering greatly. They don't want to live forever. They don't even really want to be healthy sometimes because they know that that it might get worse before it gets better. What they want is an exit strategy that would be permissible in Washington State, Montana, and Oregon, but not anywhere else in this country. A few other places more globally. And so, when I think about myself and where I fit in this, I don't want to live an outrageously long time. I also don't want to die anytime soon. I see myself eventually being one of these people who might be forced to live against my will. In other words, I think no matter how much I want to hope for the kinds of lifespan and health span gains we've been talking about today, it's not necessarily in the cards. And so that said, I've made some big changes. So I was telling a few people last night that over the past 16 months or so, I've lost about 100 pounds. And I've done that not by focusing on weight so much, and certainly not by focusing on numbers like how many pounds I weigh or what my BMI is, but rather by focusing on trying to get fitter. And the reason I wanted to get fit is not so I could live forever, but rather so that I could do other things that I haven't been able to do, like compete in endurance sports, which for me was just something to watch on TV for a great long time. And so so that's been quite lucky for me, and it's actually been I've been lucky in all sorts of ways. One, I have a decent job with flexibility in my work hours, so I can actually make time to train. Secondly, I was actually literally lucky. Around this time last year, I was in a poker tournament at a casino. I got busted out immediately, almost, with pocket aces, which was very sad, but then went and put $20 into a slot machine and won $4,000 while waiting for my friends to finish. So I went to my Tribe Multisport, which is the bike store that I deal with, and immediately bought a gorgeous 15-pound carbon frame bike that is absolutely to die for, and has been fantastically useful to me in my quest. Not everybody has those options, and that's something I want to come back to a little bit later. So there are these different kinds of exit strategies, right? Physician-assisted death might be one. Engineered negligible senescence might be another. So what I want to do is, normally as a philosopher of science, I would sort of take the science into question and sort of really probe the kinds of things that we heard on the first panel this morning and things that Jay has said as well, and say, what's going on here? Is this really feasible? When Aubrey says that the human body is a machine, it's a very complicated machine, but it's still a machine, is that actually accurate? And so on. Those are the kinds of things as a philosopher of biology I would do. That would be so dull for you all. So what I'm going to do instead is focus on this question. Let's pretend that radical life extensions, I'm going to use that phrase, but I'm just going to mean by it some extension of the lifespan, some small modicum beyond the maximum to date attainable by human beings, past or present. So 124 years is the sort of what we've seen to date. So maybe 10 years beyond that, or 100 years beyond that, or 1,000 years beyond that, if we want to be a little bit more outrageous. But even 10 years or 7 years, as Jay was just saying, would count in some ways as a quite radical extension of the human lifespan, especially if it's achieved in a relatively short period of time. You've heard from other folks today about how we might achieve that, and there's even a sense that it might be achievable as long as the appropriate strategic investments are made, as well as a continued investment in basic science. So let's pretend that radical life extension of some form comes to be. And the deep question to ask then is, will our lives in that circumstance be a virtually endless collection of all good things all the time, which would be awesome, or will, in fact, biological, social, and personal aspects of our lives be transformed in ways that might be great, might be awful, might be somewhere in between, such that we need to have a good conversation now about what we actually want to get out of this? So biological problems that might arise from radical life extension have to do potentially with the ramifications of interfering in complex systems such as we are. And even if we are just machines. We certainly don't understand very much about these machines that we are and how they work. And so there are all sorts of risks associated with that. But again, let's pretend that we can get beyond that. I'm going to focus just for a couple of minutes on social ramifications, especially regarding things like family dynamics and economic sustainability, as well as some personal ramifications, especially with regard to individual psychology, risk-taking, which gets at something that Jason, the other, said earlier, things like love and hobbies, and then again, family dynamics and money. So with regard to social ramifications, it's certainly the case that we could imagine quite dramatic changes in terms of our understanding of our obligations to our partners, to our children, to our children's children, and so on, and that these changes could be, exceptionally wonderful. We get to spend more time with our grandchildren, and so on, or they might be, really awful in all sorts of ways. In as much as maybe we won't have any interest whatsoever in spending time doing the things that that our grandchildren are doing, simply because we are so far removed from them intellectually, developmentally, and so on. And if this sort of plays out at a social scale, you could imagine some fairly dramatic repercussions that I don't want to suggest are necessarily bad. That would be totally irresponsible of me, but that do deserve to be thought about. I mean, if it's the case that we pretend that everything is going to be good all the time, if we focus on sort of our life extension as the extension of all the best bits of our lives, so that we get that in perpetuity or just about, that would be pretty irresponsible as well. So it's just as irresponsible to pretend that it's all going to be glorious as it is to pretend that it's all going to be doomsday. And so, there are at least three different kinds of ethical / political / social orientations or attitudes we can take toward radical life extension. There's one which has been characterized by various folks as a kind of bio-Luddite or sometimes bioconservative kind of perspective, where the basic idea is that we ought to be very, very cautious, in fact, maybe even just saying no to the prospect of radical life extension, whether we're talking 7 years, 70 years, or 700 years. By contrast, there's a kind of bio-libertarian approach. I don't say liberal, and I'll come back to liberal in a second. And the idea here behind a bio-libertarian approach is that we ought very well just to focus entirely on these kinds of enterprises, radical life extension enterprises, which are going to increase the capacity for human freedom, which is the ultimate value. And there are representatives, in the popular literature on these topics. The bio-Luddites, so-called, might be represented by Francis Fukuyama or Leon Kass, and the bio-libertarians might be represented by folks like Ronald Bailey. What's more interesting to me is to think about a kind of liberal response, where liberal in this country, I know some people hear liberal and they think Democrat, which might be the case. There are also plenty of liberal Republicans, at least with regard to what I mean by liberal here. A liberal approach is one that focuses on the possibility that different people have different understandings of what the good is, what the good amounts to. And it's possible for us to be good people and to disagree with each other about what the good is without actually being horrific. So what are some strategies that we might in terms of policy, and I'm going to focus just on research policy, what are some strategies that we might follow? If you're a bio-Luddite, you're just going to say no. If you're a bio-libertarian, you're going to say we need to prioritize research on this stuff above everything else. We need to redirect funding from other kinds of initiatives. Or we can get a bio-liberal approach, which is, I think, the one that Jay was just referring to in his work on the longevity dividend, where the basic idea is to set aside some proportion of exploratory funds for research in this area, but at the same time evaluate and reevaluate scientific and social priorities over time to make sure that we are on a track that we want to be on as a society. So what are some aspirational liberal values? Well, justice might be one of them, and we've heard a little bit about concern about inequality. Local, global, intergenerational as well. Think of our descendants 7 generations hence and what they might have to live for. Respect for persons, whomsoever they might be. Personal flourishing, community and solidarity, which I know Glenn Beck would disagree with me, but community and solidarity don't mean fascism. They mean something, much happier than that. democratic engagement in civil society. These are all things that we can aim for. And what we might want to do is explore the prospect of determining scientific and social priorities jointly in a collaborative way, rather than assuming with the bio-Luddite that this is a bad thing, or assuming with the bio-libertarian that it's necessarily a good thing. It could be either, it could be both. We need to figure that out. And what we need to do is discover, probe, negotiate about, revisit, and revise our values and the priorities that emerge from them. So there are lots of things that I could say more about, but Will won't let me, and I'll happily comment on them in the discussion period. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Life is short, so we are going to try to get on to the Q&A. Before we get into the audience questions, I have a couple of questions that I wanted to numbers questions. So I want to ask the numbers guys about this, and I'm targeting Jason F. and Jay here, but anybody can get in on this. One is, so the Debt Commission just came out and said that we should, according to them, these are the responsible guys, right? That we should raise the Social Security retirement age from 67 to 69 by 2075. Now, so I'm going to ask. I'll start with Jay. Given trends, and I understand that it's hard to project, but where things have been, how high do you think and how fast do you think the retirement age should be raised, if it is understood, say, as an approximation of a healthy life, the expectable healthy life, and if we were to raise it faster than the Debt Commission says by that amount, whatever you tell us it is, I'll ask Jason F. what the implications would be for the program, setting aside the variable about adjusting the program for fertility rates.
Well, all right. They probably should have started a while ago raising retirement age. It's a little too late, but it's never too late to start. So is 2 years appropriate? Honestly, I don't know. I'd have to look at the math to see how the Social Security trust funds would be influenced by this. But my understanding is that it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much of an increase in the retirement age to yield a fairly significant improvement in the solvency of the trust funds. So it may be enough.
Let me add a number there to help Jason with this. We did this a couple years ago, actually 4 or 5 years ago in Slate, and we had a demographer look at using the number of healthy years that a person could have expected when the program was founded, and then projecting that forward to today. And his projection was it should now be over 70, probably 71 or 72 at this point, and by 2015 his number was 73. Now, if we were, I mean, it's crazy, we're not going to get there, but if, let's say we went half that far, or if we, what would the effect be on the program and its finances?
Thanks, Will. First of all, I should say that when the co-chairs put out their chairman's mark, the president said he was going to refrain from commenting until the commission is done with its work, and he didn't say, except Jason Furman will come to New America and tell you what he thinks or what I think. And I think he did that for a good reason, which is that the commission has a very hard task, and he wants to give them the space that they need to work together, work with the other 16 members of that commission who have to decide whether they want to sign on or not, or what they want to do, to get something done by their deadline of December 1st. So I'm not going to comment on that. I'll give you, to help your discussions, 2 or 3 factual observations. One is, I believe the way in which they structured the retirement age, which has been in some other Social Security plans, was intended to keep the ratio of working years to retired years the same. So if somebody lives an extra year, the retirement age would go up by 2/3 of a year, and the amount of time they get to live in retirement would go up by 1/3 of a year. I believe that's a mathematical description of what they did. It's important to note in thinking about this that the retirement age was increased. It's gone from 65 to 66, and in a few years it's going to resume an increase and go to 67. And the last mathematical fact here, I think in part because of those fertility trends I said, these types of, the commission proposed a range of things, of which this was just one, to achieve solvency, and by itself 2 years, 4 years, whatever number of years, aren't going to get you solvency based on the current forecast. But those are all factual descriptions of where they were that you can all mull over.
Ted wanted to get in on this.
Because this is a conference on extreme longevity or longevity, I thought I'd try and draw what you said into that. There are already Social Security systems that are fluid, that adjust according to dependency ratios and life expectancies, and that creates some sort of national incentive, you might say, to adjust the public population profile so that neither of those gets out of whack. They remain to be proven. But in an era of far extended longevity, these programs might be essential, these kind of fluid programs, because you won't know what you're getting. But it raises some other specters that I think are worth mentioning, and these relate to Stefan's remarks earlier. If our track to longer life is the biomechanical replace body parts track, he used cochlear implants and heart valves and other things as an example, I believe. You might not get people who are fully capable of working at their full capacity, even though they are capable of working. And so people who aren't able to work at their full capacity right now, their work life is underwritten often by their pension or by Social Security. So even if we have a scenario where people living much longer can work, they might be contributing at that level, but they also might require some underwriting.
Let me throw one more numbers question at you guys before you get away. Jay, in his article in Slate, asked for, he said, give us 1%, I think, of the Medicare budget for this aging research. Now, if he could deliver, let's say the low end, 3 years of life expectancy from this program, if we shift resource, well, I won't say shift, we're not supposed to say we're taking away money from the diseases, but by investing in this, he could deliver 3 years of life extension. From a rational point of view, rationally, if you are the government and you are allocating research money, what percentage of the Medicare budget would it be rational to spend on his research program in terms of payoff?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that, and unfortunately, I guess Francis Collins isn't showing up to tell you the answer to that. There's research. Part of why increasing life expectancy is one of the best things you can do economically is people get relatively satiated in terms of material goods. There aren't like a whole lot of people that would vastly benefit from an extra TV or two. But if you live an extra year or two, it's actually complementary with everything else. It's not just that you get an extra year or two, but you can do more travel or go to more restaurants or do more stuff. So it ends up enhancing some of the benefits you get from other things as well. And when you take that complementarity into account, economists at the University of Chicago, Kevin Murphy and co-authors, have just found extraordinary benefits to anything that could increase your life expectancy. I mean, I can't remember maybe someone here knows, but it was something like if there's like a 1 in 10 chance of curing cancer, and if curing cancer is 3 years on your life expectancy, you'd want to spend $1 trillion on it. I realize you're talking about financing a different type of research, but obviously the same analog would apply to that. There's just vast gains economically.
Let me first point out that we weren't talking about extending life by 3 years. We were talking about extending health by 3 years.
Right.
Big difference.
Right.
I don't know if we would get 3 years of life, but 3 years of health, even with the same lifespan, makes a huge difference. Totally different ballgame.
Right. Sorry, I meant to say health. Let me ask one more question before we go to the audience. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
So one of the things that's really interesting about the question that Will asked, and especially the way that Jay responded, is that it forces us to ask some deep questions about what's the best way to get at improved health span, so improved health over the course of even our current lifespan, let alone extending the lifespan. And the reason I mentioned to you that story before about me losing weight was primarily because I wanted to use that as a way to set up my final remarks, which have to do with there are some really bizarre kinds of decisions that we've made over the course of the last, say, 30, 40 years in the U.S. To have gotten to the point now where it's considerably easier for a geneticist to get funding from the National Institutes of Health to find, easier, not easy, easier to study genes associated with, say, diabetes or other diseases of some interest than it is for anybody to get even a fraction of that funding to build better playgrounds or to change the way that our health system and our for that matter, our nutritional system, the fact that we subsidize exactly the opposite diet from the one that Cynthia described earlier as being so beneficial to our health. Our diet is primarily a high glycemic index diet built around sugars and starches that is heavily subsidized by the U.S. government for all sorts of reasons that might make sense, but they're nonetheless open to some scrutiny. And so what we want to do, I think, is ask a deep question about how to go about actually achieving this increase in health span. And it might be the case that it's a good idea to take 1% of the Medicare budget and devote it to anti-aging research. It might be a good idea to take 1% of that budget and devote it to other kinds of initiatives, including the public health and preventative initiatives that have had such a dramatic impact on human lifespan and health span over the last 100 years.
And rest assured, we're going to have some extra time because the next session isn't happening. So we'll run till about 12:45. But I want to throw one more question to the panel here. The big question that I gathered from most of what we've been talking about. So much emphasis from everyone on the first panel and this panel, and in Ted's initial talk about health span as opposed to lifespan. And Jay just reinforced that point. Are we talking about shifting, and Jay in his article and in his talk today made reference to a couple of concepts. He talked about diminishing returns. He's talked about a dividend, a longevity dividend. He's talked about negative trade-offs. Are we talking about thinking more rationally in a sort of brutal national payoff sense about where we invest our research money? And are we talking about shifting our mentality from keeping people alive to keeping people healthy? Are those different people, at least in the present cohort? What are the prices to be paid in terms of the constituencies, people who now expect us to be funding research on their disease that they have? And what are the moral costs of that? Are we talking about essentially saying, look, it is more valuable for us to invest in delaying the onset of disease in people who do not yet have it than it is to be focusing on extending life, which presumably some of our research money currently does. And what do we think about that? Anybody?
Well, I think this gets to the other fundamental issue that philosophers weigh in on better than I can, but it's this issue of distributive justice. I mean, do you distribute across lifetimes, or do you distribute within a lifetime? And right now, we don't have an answer to that. We allow people to spend as much as they can on themselves to distribute goods across their own lifetime, and we tax them to distribute across lifetimes. I think we have a long way to go to increasing the general health of the world's population with what we know already. But I agree with what Cynthia said. You know, there are these open-ended benefits we get from broad research and curiosity, and I don't think I have a hard time coming up with a formula for that, the utilitarian calculus for that. I think it's something we kind of, as a society, we feel our way through it. We know we get an economic benefit from research. We know we get a humanitarian benefit from spreading health and an economic benefit. And I don't think you can have a formula for splitting up the pie that way.
Well, look, we're locked into this one disease at a time approach. We've been locked into it for a very good reason. It's the old infectious disease model that originated way back more than 100 years ago, and we're simply applying it to the wrong set of diseases. In this era, in this modern era, when people live exceptionally long lives, the time has arrived for us to shift our approach to what goes wrong with us as we grow older. And that's to go after aging itself, the underlying risk factor. You said it, I thought, as well as anyone, so I'm not going to elaborate.
Just add one thing, you know, having written a book on it and with all of you, you know, it's hard. It's very hard to get people to think that way, as you know, because private medical funding comes from people who had a disease or were touched by the disease, and it goes for that disease. We all age, and it's hard to get people to focus on aging. I talk about a nursing home in Sarasota, which is a welfare home in Sarasota, mostly for women who've spent all their money and resources caring for their husbands and are left with nothing. And Sarasota has more charitable organizations per capita than any community in America, and yet the welfare home for the aged can't raise any money for itself. I think people are just kind of blocked from seeing aging as their primary issue, but they will take this kind of project approach, and because that appeals to them emotionally.
Let me ask, how many people in the room want to ask questions? Let's see how many. So we got a lot. So let's do this. Let's let a bunch of people ask questions in a row, and then we'll let the panelists choose, and then we'll see if we have enough for another round. So let's start randomly. This guy right here in the blue jeans, and we'll try to take 5, and then we'll let the panelists go around.
Yes. I personally don't think that finances will be a major issue because of digital fabrication technology, which is more commonly known as a 3D printer. I mean, it would provide for all of our material needs. Therefore, we won't really need to work for anything.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
Okay.
Yes or no? That was the question.
Sorry, back there, hand raised.
Jason Furman kind of opened the door to this. The aging of populations is associated in some countries that don't have a lot of immigration with an absolute decline in population. Has anyone figured out how to have a good economy, and we can talk about what the definition of good is, with a declining population?
Okay. To your right there.
I'm Helen Raffel, age 82. I had to retire at age 77, unfortunately, because of ruptured discs, but I would have gone on much longer. But isn't the solution to having an older population to have more working age immigrants? Isn't that what we've done historically?
Okay. Sorry, Aubrey had a question over here.
Yeah, I've got a question about the Longevity Dividend Initiative, so I guess it's mainly to Jay and I guess also to Dan. In the papers that you produced, you obviously talked about the benefits of postponing the ill health of old age by roughly 7 years, and so we can think about that as combating the ill health of old age pre-symptomatically. But within that, the spectrum of how we might do that, there's the question of how pre-symptomatically, whether we can, let's say, arrest aging completely for 7 years in middle age, or whether we have to do it in childhood, or whether we actually reverse aging by 7 years more or less instantaneously. You know, there are various biomedical scenarios. I'm wondering whether in your discussions with policymakers or other people, you've actually explored these various alternatives and, of course, the varying economic consequences of those alternatives. A year or so ago, I and a number of very distinguished gerontologists and published a paper in Science Translational Medicine which tried in a very preliminary way to explore this. But I'm wondering whether you think it's the way to go in pushing the longevity dividend concept forward in political terms.
Thank you, everybody, for keeping the questions brief. We'll have 2 more in this group, and then we'll let the panelists respond. Sorry, a woman here. Anybody in the back who wants to ask? We have a little trouble getting the microphone back there, I think, in terms of reception.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Annabelle Fisher. I'm a professionally trained clinician who's worked in mental health and the healthcare field in some of the top teaching hospitals in the United States. I want to address an issue I know you all have been talking about with regard to aging, and I think it's been a very interesting conversation, having worked with the elderly and what have you. Why do we need to slow down the aging process? We're not slowing down the growing up process. But my question has to do with, I'm getting older and I like it. It's not too bad. But with regard to health extensions that you're talking about with aging, we need to really start having a discussion about death and dying. That's really what this is all about, folks. We're so afraid to talk about it. And I know my mother did die from Alzheimer's-related illnesses. Psychiatry is an art, not a science. There's no cures. Thank you, Mr. Olshansky. You're talking about aging chronic illnesses. So you give me a couple more years, but give me a quality of life. So let's have some discussions about death and dying. And why you aren't having any. Thank you.
Thank you. And we can take one more question. Can someone just step forward so we can make sure we get a reception? Thank you.
Hi, Bob Rosenblatt, freelance writer. I'd like to ask Professor Olshansky, you said if cancer and heart disease, stroke are cured, it would add 7 years. My question is, what would people then die of, and would those things cost more or less than what we spend to treat cancer, stroke, and heart disease?
Okay. Let's let the panelists respond to any of those that interest them. And Jay wanted to deal with ageism at some point, so I'll give him the opportunity if he wants to take a shot at that too.
All right. I looked at the clock. Well, let me answer this last question first on what people would die of. So we actually, in a way, already know the answer to this question, because there are already people among us who don't die from heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And what happens to them, they're very much, in many ways, like I think the mice that Cynthia was talking about. They die from multiple organ failure. In other words, we don't really know. But actually in humans, what we often see is Alzheimer's disease, neurodegenerative problems crop up and become much worse than they are now. You would also see infectious diseases, simple things, influenza, the kinds of things that the rest of us, at our younger ages can survive very easily. Once you make it out to these extreme old ages, the immune system ages along with everything else. It would be Alzheimer's, the neurodegenerative problems, and infectious diseases. I wanted to, let me just take a minute to address the issue of the discussion of death and dying that came up as well, so this is the entree to the discussion that happened last night at dinner. So for those of you who weren't there, the reason why I'm so tired right now, quite frankly, is because I didn't sleep well last night, because I was very disturbed by a discussion that happened over dinner last night. And let me just give you a little bit of background. In 1883, Sir Francis Galton, and then shortly thereafter George Bernard Shaw, Madison Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, H.G. Wells, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Linus Pauling, and Margaret Sanger all promoted the concept of eugenics, suggesting that there are subgroups among us that are undesirable and that we need to get rid of them. When Galton first developed the idea, it was positive eugenics. Let's find a way to increase the fertility among those that we desire. It took about 60 years, but the transformation from positive eugenics shifted from an increase in fertility among the desirable to a decrease in fertility among the undesirable subgroups of the population, and we sterilized about 60,000 people in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And then shortly thereafter, negative eugenics reared its ugly head, and basically it shifted to kill the undesirable subgroups of the population. Last night, it took about 60 seconds. Instead of 60 years, it was 60 seconds. So it started with enhancement technologies. Let's talk about improving public health. Let's talk about extending healthy life. But it quickly digressed to eliminate I don't know if this is a digression, to eliminating harmful diseases, then healthcare rationing based on age, and then let's just kill the old to make way for the young. And I have to say that this was extremely disturbing to me when I heard this last night. I won't go into any further detail on this except to say that next week I'm heading off to Dubai. I'm a member of the World Economic Forum on the Council on an Aging Society. And last year I ran that meeting with Bob Butler, the person who invented the concept of ageism. He didn't invent the concept. He sort of lit the torch to identify ageism. And I'm going to suggest that at the meeting next week that we put forth a convention that essentially protects the rights of the elderly to combat exactly what we heard last night.
Thanks, Jay.
Yep.
Anybody else want to comment on any of the questions?
I'd like to weigh in on the immigrant question by first saying it highlights the conflation of all of these issues and how the discussion on it can get confused. That is an aging population issue, and the question was raised in terms of countries that don't allow immigrants. It is an interesting question for aging societies because immigration both causes places to age and it is the solution for aging places. So think about Spain in the year 2000. It had virtually no foreign-born residents, very, very small. It began to tip from a country that was more old than young around that year. By 2009, it was 12% foreign-born. 1 out of 8 people in Spain was foreign-born. Large number of those come from, large number of those come from South America and North Africa to act as caregivers in the Spanish economy. Ecuador alone has sent 500,000 people to Spain, most of them women, to serve as caregivers in Spain. Ecuador, as a result, about 500,000 also live around the New York area. Ecuador itself is now the largest sending country for immigrants, and it has gone from being a young country to an old country. You could change your demographic by sending people, not just by receiving people. So I thought I would just add that.
Thanks. Any other comments? No?
Wait.
Yeah.
Actually, let me comment real quickly on the immigration issue. A few years ago, I was at a meeting in Italy with a large number of young economists. No offense to the young economists, but actually it was relevant because the young economists in Italy were suggesting that this dramatic reduction in fertility rates is going to create a serious labor shortage. What are we going to do? So they were all saying, all right, we've got to increase fertility. We've got to find a way to get women in Italy to produce more babies. And I raised my hand. I said, are you crazy? Do you have any sense of history at all? We fought for decades to get fertility rates down. The women of Italy were educated. Once you educate women, fertility rates drop, and they're pretty much going to stay down. I said, well, you've only got 2 options. I said, one is to increase migration, which the Italians weren't really interested in at all. And I said the third option, which is the most obvious, is to find ways to encourage older individuals to remain in the labor force longer, to use the resources that already exist within your population.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay, so one of the things I've learned as I've gotten older is one problem is a problem, but sometimes if you have 2 problems, you can put them together and make a solution. So we have 2 problems. One is that Francis Collins wasn't able to be with us today because he had to go to speak at the Hill, as was mentioned earlier today. The second thing is there are still people who have some questions out there. So hopefully some of our speakers will have to go, but some will be around. And those of you who have questions remaining, there's food out, the food that was originally ordered. So everybody can still eat. You can still talk amongst yourselves. You can still talk to the panelists, but you might have to bring them a sandwich and a drink. Okay? So everybody please give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.